History's most lopsided military victory was won by an army that had no weapons, no leaders, and no plan. An army of birds. In the vast, sun-scorched plains of Western Australia, a modern, mechanized human military declared war on the animal kingdom. And the animal kingdom won. This wasn't a fable, it wasn't a myth. It was 1932, and it was the Great Emu War. The Australian government deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to wage a campaign of extermination against 20,000 giant, flightless birds. The result was a national humiliation, a comedy of errors written in dust and feathers, and a lesson in the brutal, unpredictable power of nature. This is the story of how a nation, forged in the fires of the Great War, lost a battle against an enemy it could never understand. The strange and forgotten corners of history are often the most revealing. If you agree and want to help us uncover more stories like this, take a moment to subscribe to History Echoes Hub, like this video, and ring that notification bell. It helps our channel more than you know, and ensures you never miss an echo from the past. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a promise. The year is 1918. The Great War, the war to end all wars, is finally over. Australian soldiers, who had earned a fearsome reputation in the trenches of Gallipoli and the mud of the Western Front, are coming home. They are heroes. But a hero's welcome doesn't put food on the table. The Australian government, grateful for their sacrifice and worried about mass unemployment in the cities, had a grand idea. It was called the Soldier Settlement Scheme. The government would buy up huge tracts of land, carve them into farms, and offer them to returning veterans on favorable terms. It was a beautiful dream. A chance for these men, who had seen the worst of humanity, to build a new life from the soil, to trade the shriek of artillery for the whisper of the wind in the wheat. Thousands of veterans signed up. They packed their meager belongings and headed for the frontier, particularly to the remote, undeveloped wheat belt of Western Australia. This was not easy land. It was dry, challenging country. The sun was a relentless hammer, and the rain was a fickle friend. But these were tough men. They had survived far worse. With grit and determination, they cleared the bush, plowed the earth, and planted their crops. They built simple homes, started families, and slowly, painstakingly, began to carve a life out of the wilderness. For a few years, the dream held. Wheat prices were good, the harvests were decent. It seemed that the promise of a peaceful, prosperous life was within their grasp. Then, the world broke. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The shockwaves rippled across the globe, and the Great Depression began. For the farmers of Western Australia, it was a catastrophe. The price of wheat, their only source of income, plummeted. It fell so low that it was barely worth the cost of harvesting. The government, which had encouraged them to grow more and more wheat, now offered subsidies that were insultingly small. These proud veterans, who had fought for their country, were now facing foreclosure. The banks that had lent them money to start their farms were circling like vultures. The dream was turning into a dust-choked nightmare. They were trapped. They had invested everything, their money, their sweat, their hopes, into this land. And now, it was threatening to swallow them whole. As if economic ruin wasn't enough, another enemy was gathering on the horizon. An enemy as old as the continent itself. Every year, after their breeding season in the interior, vast numbers of emus would migrate towards the coast in search of food and water. This was a natural, ancient rhythm of the land. But the new farms had changed the equation. The farmers had inadvertently created an oasis. Their dams provided water. Their fields of wheat provided an all-you-can-eat buffet. And the fences they built to keep out rabbits were just perfect for funneling the migrating birds directly into their crops. In 1932, the migration was bigger than ever before. An estimated 20,000 emus, a vast, feathered horde, descended upon the farmlands of the Campion district. They were not malicious, they were simply hungry, but to the desperate farmers, they were a plague. An emu is a formidable creature, the second largest bird in the world. An adult can stand 6 feet tall and weigh over 100 pounds. They can run at speeds of 30 miles per hour, their long, powerful legs eating up the ground. They are also incredibly destructive. In their search for food, they trampled the fragile wheat stalks. What they didn't eat, they ruined. Worse, they would charge headlong into fences, tearing great holes in the wire mesh. These gaps not only let more emus in, but also provided an open door for the rabbits, another devastating pest. A farmer could spend a week mending his fences, only to wake up the next morning and find them shredded again, his fields swarming with giant, hungry birds. The farmers were at their wits' end. They had tried shooting the birds themselves with rifles, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. The emus were surprisingly resilient. Their shaggy, primitive feathers acted like a coat of armor, and their bodies could absorb multiple bullets without slowing down. Plus, there were just too many of them. For every one they shot, 100 more seemed to take its place. They were watching their livelihoods being eaten and trampled into the dirt. Their pleas to the government for financial aid had fallen on deaf ears. They were desperate, and desperate men turned to desperate measures. A delegation of the ex-soldier farmers traveled to Perth to meet with the Australian Minister for Defence, Sir George Pearce. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for food. They made a strange and audacious request. They were veterans. They knew the power of modern weaponry. They asked the minister for machine guns. They argued that if these birds were a plague, they should be dealt with like one, with overwhelming, decisive force. They proposed that the army itself should be deployed to handle the problem. Sir George Pearce listened. He was a politician, and he saw a multifaceted opportunity. Firstly, it was a chance to be seen doing something for the struggling veterans. It would be a powerful piece of public relations. The government was helping the heroes it had seemingly forgotten. Secondly, the military had been looking for opportunities for live fire training, particularly for its machine gunners. What better way to practice than on thousands of large, fast-moving targets? Thirdly, he genuinely believed it would work. The idea of a few soldiers with Lewis machine guns failing to defeat a flock of birds would have seemed utterly preposterous. The Lewis gun was a veteran of the Great War, a weapon that had cut down legions of men. What chance would an emu have? There was also a bizarre economic angle. Pearce hoped that the operation could be a source of revenue. Emu skins could be used for leather, their feathers for hats, and their fat rendered for oil. A Perth entrepreneur had even offered to make 1,000 pairs of slippers from the hides. The government planned to fund the operation by harvesting the carcasses. It was a win-win-win situation. The farmers would be saved, the soldiers would get training, and the whole affair might even turn a profit. The decision was made. The Commonwealth of Australia was officially going to war. The media, at first, treated the story with a kind of fascinated seriousness. A local newspaper, the Coolgardie Miner, reported on the plan with an almost biblical gravity, calling the emus a menace of invasion and describing their advance as an army of feathered marauders. The stage was set for a conflict of epic, if slightly absurd, proportions. In late October 1932, the Expeditionary Force was assembled. It was not a large army. It consisted of 3 men from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. In command was Major G.P.W. Meredith. With him were Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran. Their arsenal consisted of 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. A cinematographer from Fox Movie Tone, an early newsreel company, was also sent along to capture the glorious victory for audiences back home. Major Meredith was a career soldier. He was confident, professional, and utterly unprepared for what he was about to face. As his truck rumbled into the dusty, beleaguered town of Campion, he must have felt a sense of supreme confidence. He was a modern soldier, armed with one of the most effective killing machines of the era. His enemy was a big bird to be sure, but a bird nonetheless. This would be less of a war and more of a pest control exercise, a quick, efficient cull. He expected to be done in a matter of days. The local farmers greeted him as a savior. They pointed out the main concentrations of emus and offered their services as guides and beaters. The plan was simple. The farmers would act like sheepdogs, herding the emus towards the waiting machine guns. Meredith would then open fire, and the problem would be solved. The first engagement was scheduled for November 2nd. The hunt was on. On that first day, Meredith and his men headed to a spot where a flock of about 50 emus had been seen. The birds were just out of range of the guns. The local settlers attempted to herd the flock into an ambush, but the emus were not cooperative. They were wary, intelligent creatures. Instead of moving as a single, predictable mass, they split into small groups and scattered in all directions, making them impossible to target effectively. The first day of the war ended without a single shot being fired. It was a frustrating but minor setback. The real test came 2 days later, on November 4th. The soldiers had received intelligence that a large mob of emus, perhaps 1,000 strong, was gathered near a local dam. This was their chance. They carefully positioned one of the Lewis guns, concealed it, and waited. The trap was set. As the sun climbed higher, the huge flock of birds began to move towards the water. It was a perfect ambush. The gunners held their breath, fingers on the trigger. The emus ambled closer and closer, completely unaware of the danger. Major Meredith gave the order. Fire! The Lewis gun roared to life, its staccato bark echoing across the silent landscape. For a split second, it was a scene of utter carnage. A dozen birds fell in the initial burst. The soldiers must have felt a surge of triumph. But then, something happened that no one expected. The 1,000-strong mob of emus did not panic in a predictable way. They did not flee together in a straight line away from the danger. Instead, the instant the bullets hit, the entire flock exploded outwards. They ran in every direction, a chaotic feathered storm. They were, in Meredith's own later words, as difficult to hit as Zulus. The gunner frantically tried to track the scattering targets. He sprayed bullets across the plain, but it was useless. The emus ran with incredible speed and an erratic, zigzagging motion. Hitting one was a matter of pure luck. After the first few seconds of the ambush, the element of surprise was gone. The birds were simply too fast and too dispersed. To make matters worse, after firing a few hundred rounds, the gun jammed. By the time the soldiers had cleared the stoppage, the emus were gone, vanished into the bush. Major Meredith surveyed the scene. The dust settled, the silence returned. A handful of emu carcasses, perhaps 12, lay on the ground. He had fired hundreds of rounds of ammunition to kill a dozen birds. The rest of the 1,000-strong flock had escaped completely unscathed. It was a tactical disaster. The cinematographer, who had been hoping for footage of a glorious military triumph, had only captured a few seconds of chaotic, ineffective firing. Meredith was baffled and deeply frustrated. These birds were not behaving like any enemy he had ever conceived of. They were resilient. He noted with astonishment that even when hit with multiple bullets, the birds would often keep running, disappearing over the horizon to die a slow death far from the battlefield. Their thick, matted feathers seemed to provide a strange kind of protection, deflecting the bullets or causing them to tumble, reducing their impact. He decided to change tactics. If a static ambush wouldn't work, he would take the fight to them. He ordered one of the Lewis guns to be mounted on the back of a truck. This would create a mobile firing platform. They could chase the emus down. It was an early, crude form of mechanized warfare. They soon spotted a small group of emus, and the chase began. The truck bounced and bucked wildly over the rough, uneven farmland. The gunner in the back struggled to keep his balance, let alone aim the heavy machine gun. The ride was so rough that he couldn't get a single shot off. Meanwhile, the emus, unburdened by a 2-ton truck, effortlessly outpaced them. They darted through the scrub, their long legs gliding over obstacles that threatened to break the truck's axle. At one point, an emu that was running alongside the truck suddenly veered in front of it and crashed into the fence. The truck, trying to avoid the tangled bird and wire, swerved violently and smashed through the fence itself, damaging the vehicle and nearly throwing the gunner from the back. The emus, once again, disappeared. The mobile assault had been an even greater failure than the ambush. Meredith was growing desperate. His report from this period reads like the diary of a man on the verge of a breakdown. He wrote, "The emus have proved that they are not so stupid as they are usually considered to be. Each mob has its leader, always an enormous black-plumed bird standing fully 6 feet high, who keeps watch while his fellows busy themselves with the wheat. At the first sign of danger, he gives the signal, and they scatter in all directions." He had begun to see them not as animals, but as an organized, disciplined army. He famously commented, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." The press, which had initially been supportive, began to catch wind of the fiasco. The story was just too good to ignore. The image of the mighty Australian army being outsmarted by a bunch of birds was irresistible. The headlines started to turn from serious to satirical. A conservationist in the Australian Parliament dryly asked whether a medal would be awarded to the emus for their victory. The story spread overseas. Newspapers in London and New York picked it up. The Great Emu War was becoming an international joke. Back in Australia, the political pressure was mounting on Sir George Pearce. He was being ridiculed in Parliament. The operation was clearly a failure. It was costing money, wasting ammunition, and making the entire country a laughingstock. On November 8th, just 6 days after the first engagement, Pearce bowed to the pressure. He ordered Major Meredith and his men to withdraw. The first campaign of the Great Emu War was over. The official report was grim. The military had expended 2,500 rounds of ammunition. The number of confirmed kills was debated. Some reports said as few as 50. A more generous estimate, likely from Meredith himself, claimed between 200 and 300. Even using the most generous number, it meant they had used 10 rounds of ammunition for every single bird killed. By any measure, it was an abysmal failure. The emus had won. The soldiers packed up their guns and their bruised egos and retreated from the field of battle. The 20,000 emus remained, continuing their campaign of crop destruction, utterly victorious. For the farmers, the army's retreat was a betrayal. Their saviors had abandoned them. The problem was not solved. In fact, it was getting worse. The weather grew hotter and drier, driving even more emus from the interior towards their fields. The farmers once again pleaded with the government for help. They sent telegrams, they held meetings. They insisted that the army, despite its initial failure, was their only hope. They argued that Meredith had been unlucky, hampered by bad weather and a faulty strategy. They begged for a second chance. Sir George Pearce was in a difficult position. On one hand, the first attempt had been a public relations disaster. On the other, the farmers, many of them veterans, were genuinely suffering, and he had a political duty to help them. He also likely felt a sting of personal and national pride. The idea that the Australian military could be defeated by birds was intolerable. After a heated debate in Parliament, he reluctantly agreed. The war was back on. On November 13, 1932, just 5 days after being recalled, Major Meredith was sent back to the front. He was a man with a score to settle. He had been humiliated. He had been laughed at. This time, he was determined to be more effective. He had learned from his mistakes. He abandoned the idea of large-scale ambushes and mobile assaults. He would now focus on smaller, more targeted engagements, getting as close as possible before opening fire to maximize the effectiveness of each bullet. The second campaign was, by comparison, more successful. Meredith and his men became more proficient hunters. They learned the emus' habits, their patterns of movement. They stalked them patiently, crawling through the scrub to get within effective range. The kill rate improved significantly. On the first day of the second campaign, they reported killing around 40 emus. A few days later, on December 2nd, they had their most successful engagement of the entire war. They managed to ambush a mob and killed, by their count, over 100 birds before the rest scattered. For nearly a month, Meredith waged a grinding war of attrition. It was grueling, thankless work. He and his 2 men were operating in the blistering heat of the Australian summer, constantly covered in dust, plagued by flies. They spent their days tracking, stalking, and shooting, and their nights cleaning their weapons and planning the next day's hunt. The official reports from this period paint a picture of methodical, relentless killing. Meredith's dispatches to headquarters listed the daily tally: 80 emus killed, 35 emus killed, 120 emus accounted for. But the numbers told another story. Even with their improved tactics, they were fighting a losing battle. They were killing dozens, sometimes 100 emus a day, but there were 20,000 of them. The impact on the overall emu population was negligible. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. For every mob they decimated, another would appear over the horizon a few days later. The vastness of the Australian continent and the sheer number of their enemy made a decisive victory impossible. By early December, it was clear that the operation was unsustainable. The cost of ammunition, the wear and tear on the equipment, and the deployment of the soldiers far outweighed the benefits. While the farmers in the immediate vicinity reported some relief, the emu problem persisted across the wider region. The government had spent a significant amount of money and military resources, and all it had to show for it was a few hundred dead birds and a reputation for absurdity. On December 10, 1932, Major Meredith received his final orders. The operation was to be terminated. He was to pack up his guns and return to base. The Great Emu War was officially and finally over. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were stark. Over the course of the 2 campaigns, Major Meredith and his men had fired 9,860 rounds of machine gun ammunition. The official number of emus killed was 986. This gave a kill ratio of exactly 10 bullets for every 1 bird. It's also important to remember that this was the official count. It's likely many more birds were wounded and died later, but it's also possible the numbers were inflated to make the operation seem more successful than it was. Even with the official numbers, it was a catastrophic failure of military efficiency. The cost of the bullets alone was far more than the value of the crops they had saved. Major Meredith, in his final report, tried to put a brave face on it. He claimed that his men had suffered no casualties. He argued that if the operation had continued, the emu menace could have been wiped out. But no one was listening. The war was over, and the emus had, for all intents and purposes, won. They had withstood the best a modern military could throw at them and had survived. They had not been defeated, merely inconvenienced. The aftermath of the Great Emu War was a strange mix of comedy and consequence. The story became a permanent and beloved part of Australian folklore. It was a classic tale of the underdog, a story of Aussie battlers, in this case, feathered ones, standing up to authority. It became a national inside joke, a symbol of the often futile struggle against the harsh and unpredictable nature of the Australian continent. For decades, it was told and retold as a funny anecdote, a quirky piece of historical trivia. For the farmers, however, the laughter was hollow. Their problem had not been solved. In the years that followed, they continued to struggle with the emu migrations. But the government, having been burned so badly, never again considered a military solution. Instead, a more practical and ultimately more effective system was put in place. The government offered a bounty for emu beaks. This encouraged the farmers and professional hunters to cull the birds themselves. It was a decentralized, sustained effort that proved far more effective than a short, concentrated military campaign. In 1934 alone, over 57,000 bounties were claimed. The most effective solution, however, was not a weapon at all. It was a fence. The government eventually provided funding to build stronger, taller, and more extensive barrier fences specifically designed to exclude emus from the agricultural areas. This, combined with the bounty system, finally brought the problem under control. The lesson was clear. The solution to an agricultural problem was not military force, but better agricultural infrastructure. It was a lesson learned at the cost of considerable national embarrassment. And what of the main players? Sir George Pierce, the Minister for Defense, survived the political fallout, but the Emu War remained a permanent, slightly comical stain on his long career. Major G.P.W. Meredith faded back into the anonymity of military life, forever remembered not for his service in the Great War, but as the commander who lost a war to birds. But the true victor, the undisputed champion, was the Emu. They had faced down machine guns and emerged, if not entirely unscathed, then certainly undefeated. They had proven themselves to be masters of their environment, a symbol of resilience, adaptation, and the wild, untamable spirit of Australia. They had not fought with strategy or malice, but simply by being themselves, fast, tough, and unpredictable. They had held a mirror up to humanity's hubris, to our belief that technology and military might can solve any problem. Today, the emu is a protected native species in Australia. Its population is stable. It remains a national icon, appearing on the Australian coat of arms alongside the kangaroo. It stands there as a symbol of the nation, a silent, feathered veteran of a forgotten war. The Great Emu War serves as a powerful and hilarious reminder that humanity is not always the master of the natural world. Sometimes when we try to impose our will upon it, nature has a funny way of fighting back. The machine gun, an invention that had redefined warfare and brought empires to their knees, had been deployed in the dusty plains of Western Australia, and it was met with an enemy it could not conquer. An enemy that simply ran away, scattered, and lived to fight another day. The battlefields of Europe had been conquered by steel and strategy, but the Australian outback and its defiant, feathered inhabitants would not be so easily tamed. What do you think is the strangest, most unbelievable event in military history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone. And, as always, thank you for joining us here at History Echoes Hub.